Once upon a time, there was a happy family. They went by the name of Castle, and folks like to say they had a happy home, but what they said to themselves was that they had a happy castle. And their happiness they owed, in fact, to the point that they knew exactly what made each other happy. Dad, well, he loved his classical music, and he knew that if he went along to his son's pop concerts so well, his son would go to his and they would listen to each other's music. And he knew that as he played cricket and got his son involved, well, he would also go along and support his son playing tennis. And his daughter, well, the daughter, she loved her theatre, and it wasn't hard for her to go to concerts. She loved classical music, and Dad loved theatre. But her stamp collection, now that was a strange one, but because she supported him, he supported her, and so it went. And Mum? Well, she was happy as long as everybody else was happy. Yes, she liked to paint and she didn't mind pottering around the garden, but as far as she was concerned, everything was good in their little world. And it was more or less. I mean, Dad, he didn't mind living in East Grinstead, even though it was the butt end of many jokes. And it was right near the High Weald, which has to be said is an area of outstanding national beauty. But he wanted to see other beautiful places. He didn't want to just read about them in the National Geographic. He wanted to fly off and see the world. And yes, he loved cricket, but he wanted to write about it himself. And his son, well, he was happy. He was delighted, in fact, to go down to Torquay to the Radio 1 show and speak to Dave Lee Travers about the bands. But he actually wanted to interview the bands himself and write about those himself. And the daughter, well, she collected those stamps that nobody understood because they represented other places in the world, places she wanted to go to. She wanted to have an adventure and then write about it and turn it into theatre. And so they weren't quite happy, but, they were happy enough, and that's what Mum thought. And all was well in their world, but was not well at all in the world at large, because a war was looming. And when finally it found their shores, Dad, as all the men were, was drafted into the army. And this quietly he was excited about, because he signed up for the Air Force and thinking that, well, he could fly, he could go and see those places, he could see the world. And in the madness and the mayhem and the muddle of war, he was actually signed up for the Navy. Wasn't so bad, though. He wasn't far from home. He was based at Southampton Docks. He could go home and see his family. But when the bombs began to fall on Southampton, suddenly his family wasn't far enough away. And he and the wife talked and decided that it would probably be a good idea if the children went off to Cornwall to stay with her twin sister, Tina. So off they went to Paddington Station, where they stood with their suitcases in hand and their trunks ready, and the bombs began to fall on London. And as they fell, and the sound of them crashing and the sound of sirens wailing, Dad said, "No way. I am not taking you by train." "How are we going to get there?" said the son. "By boat," said Dad. "What?" said the son. "It's all right taking the boat out to Weston and Breen, but sailing all the way to Cornwall?" "I am in the Navy," said Dad. And standing there in his uniform, he suddenly looked like the man of stature that he was, and the kids found confidence in that. So they bundled their things back into that second-hand 75-pound Morris and drove on down to the coast and put their things on their small sailing boats. And they set off across the smooth, sunlit waters. Suddenly, the winds and the waves changed as a storm swept over the sea, and where before there were gentle dips and inclines, now there were suddenly huge troughs and high, impossible waves. And down, down, down they would go into the troughs, up those gunmetal waves until the boat seemed like it would keel right over, and the sun was holding on until the thunder boomed and the lightning crashed. And for a boy who loved bands, he really hated loud noises, and so he covered his ears, taking his hands off the boat. And Dad called out, "No, hold on, son!" But the son closed his eyes and did the only thing that could keep him sane. He sang, "Wild boys, never lose it. Wild boys never chose this way. Wild boys never close your eyes. Wild boys always shine. And as he sang to the winds and the waves, his sister picked up the song, and the son opened up his eyes as the words told him to do so, and so did Dad start singing, and before you knew it, they were shouting and holding on, but not for dear life, for fun, riding those waves, and suddenly the ocean seemed like a band to the sun. The lightning playing cymbals, the thunder booming drums, and the ocean itself playing out lead guitar. They rocked and danced in their defiance until the morning came. Found the boat gently bobbing on the waters, and daughter and son nestled under each arm of their father with their heads on his chest, all of them fast asleep and dreaming of all the things they loved. So when they woke up, they were strangely contented, as though they had died in the storm and had found in death only dreams come true. But they woke up hungry, and so Dad asked them to check their supplies. They opened up their trunks, and the army rations he'd given them just for fun were suddenly very necessary. And those 3 box loads full of mince pies that Mum had given them as though by eating them they'd miss her less looked very good indeed. And the whole tray full of vegetables and fruits that he'd brought from castle stores to give to their aunt, well, they looked good too. And comforting, only for Dad, was the fact that he was still wearing his hip flask. Dad said to them, looking at their supplies, he didn't know where they were. They could have been blown anywhere in the Atlantic, and he figured maybe they'd been blown maybe southwest, and perhaps if they turned their sails and headed northeast, they'd find their way back home, and they did so, but the winds were blowing the other way. It pressed and pushed against the sails of that small boat until they looked like they'd rip, and Dad took them down. And he looked the kids in the eyes, and he said, you know, my granddad used to say that he was the only son of an only son, and his son was too, and so am I, and he used to say that it was okay that we were the only child because we had the luck enough for many, and I feel lucky. And you know, it reminds me of something else he used to say. He used to say, sometimes you just have to go where the wind takes you and make the most of it. So come on, kids. Are you up for an adventure? Yes, they called. They set sails and they went with the wind, flowing out on the ocean. And the son suddenly piped up and said, hang on, Dad, isn't Auntie Tina going to miss us? Pah, said Dad, you never loved her anyway. Come on, daughter, sing us a strong theatrical song to send us on our way. And so, standing up, dramatically raising her arm, the daughter sang a rendition of her favorite Evita song. Don't cry for me, Auntie Tina. You know the truth is we never loved you. All through our wild days, our mad existence, we kept our promise, we'll keep our distance. And they laughed and they sailed off happily. And it was something of a miracle that after days on the water, they found that they could see coast. And they thought, as the sun was setting and they began to fall asleep, that they would wake the next day and be home, where they still had supplies and miraculously high spirits. But the next morning came, and they were not settled on a beach, but on a river, floating, coasting down a wide, broad river where a canopy of dark, deep trees covered them in the muggy heat. A bright blue butterfly flitted across the way, and the other way came a parrot, impossibly rainbow-coloured, screeching into the sky, and the children's eyes were wide. Dad's eyes were wider. His mouth was slack as he said, "The Amazon rainforest." He'd seen pictures of it in his National Geographic, but somehow here they were, and it seemed crazy to him, and as he thought that thought, he saw his daughter's hand trailing in the water, and he said, "Get your hands out of the water!" And she pulled them out, and piranhas came snapping up out of the water, clawing, even trying to get into the ship. The father picked up an oar and hit one of them out across the water. The son shouted, "For 4! He hit another one, clean across the other side. The son said, 6! He picked up an oar of his own and hit a fish across the water like a stone. And the father said, Ace! And they hit and they batted, and eventually when the fish subsided, they lay back laughing, feeling their hearts pounding, hearing their hearts pounding. No, there was something else pounding. There were drums, actual drums, playing out around them. And as they held each other tighter, the daughter looked out across the water, and there, an enormous crocodile, at least 3 times the size of their boat, sailed through the water towards them. The son and the dad picked up oars, immediately realizing that they would be useless, but the daughter grabbed for a box of mince pies and started lobbing them at the crocodile. One hit against its mouth, and it turned and snapped at it before it sank into the water. And then the father and son, taking cue, picked up mince pies and started throwing them further and further, leading the crocodile away, happy with its desserts. And even as they laughed, a net was thrown over the boat, and they were hauled up out of the water, onto the shore, and into the misty trees. And as the boat stopped and the net slumped, that distant sound of drums got closer and closer and louder and faster until it became quite frenetic and stopped. And out of the mists, from every direction, stepped a man. Thick, muscular legs, leather loincloths, solid abdomens and chests, rolling shoulders, tough arms and knotted hands, in which each of them held a spear in one and a strange square bag in the other. And as their faces came through the mists, it was strange to see that they were Caucasian, which didn't fit the parts, and they had rolling, beautiful, curled beards and stern eyes. And as the children hugged their father, the daughter tugged on his sleeve and said, Dad, look! And from behind the men stepped the tallest being they'd ever seen. So huge, in fact, that these other men only reached this character's belly button. The great muscular being stooped down, and as his shoulders showed through the mist, you could see that they were covered in feathers, and he had a bone yellow beak and black eyes in his dark feathered head. And he said, "Welcome. You must be thirsty." And as he said so, as though they had been there all along, proud Peruvian women appeared from behind the trees and gave a skin of water to each of the family. And they slaked back their water, enjoying its refreshing waters because they'd rationed when they were on the boats. And as they drank, the father remembered himself, and stopping drinking, he thought that the way these stories went, he should give over a gift of his own. And so he found his hand going to his hip flask, which he offered out to the great Birdman. The Birdman took it and took a mighty swig before the son, seeing what was happening, could stop him. "Squeak!" called out the great bird. "That's strong stuff," said the bird. And then he looked at the man and his children and said, "I know of stronger stuff. Immensely strong if you would dare to partake of it." "Dare?" said the father, and suddenly the craziness of their situation overwhelmed him so that he was reckless with his words. "Dare? We have crossed a whole ocean in this boat. We have lived through a death-defying storms. We've fought off piranhas and tricked that bloody great crocodile. Dare? I think we could do anything." And he looked at his children and he knew that it was true. And the Birdman said, "Very well. Allow me to take you to my home in the hills." And then the Birdman apologized that they would have to be netted up again, and they were. And as the rope pulled taut in the Birdman's hands, great black wings unfurled from behind him, two facing up and two facing down. They began to beat steadily and gently as he lifted up off the ground and pulled on that net like it was being hoisted by a hot air balloon. Up, above tall, impossibly tall trees, and out east, across to those shining, sharp silver mountains, where they eventually were settled down on a leeway to a great cave. "The Palace of the Moon," said the Birdman, as he let them out of their nets. And out of the intricately cut caves came the humble Peruvian people in their flamboyant traditional dress, bringing with them food and drink to replenish the family. And finally, when they were seated and drinking hot cocoa and wild honey, they tried to talk. And they found that, the Peruvian people didn't understand what they were saying, even as they tried to recount their adventure. So the daughter, being theatrical as she was, stood up and mimed. And to her delight, even though the people didn't understand English, they understood theatre. And so she recounted the best scenes, her favorite scenes from her favorite shows, her favorite numbers, and the people cheered and laughed and clapped, and her father beamed with pride. And they slept easily. And the next morning, they were ushered into the room where a wise, sad-eyed shaman told them that they could take part in an ayahuasca ceremony. They would drink a drink made from 2 vines that would open up their eyes and allow them to see beyond their dull human form. But it would be a messy process. He said in distinctly clear English, their bodies would expel every blockage from the top and the bottom, and it would be quite an ordeal, but it would be worth it. In fact, the reward would be endless. Were they willing to do it? And the father looked at his children. Older teens now, and especially after what they'd just been through, he realized they could make the decision for themselves. And they looked at their father, seeing that look in his eyes, and it was a sweet and beautiful moment, even though at the same time it was sad, because they knew that in some way he was letting go, and they could hear the distant sound of goodbyes that would come in time. But still they said yes, and they all took part, drinking that strange drink that made their bodies do crazy things, but took their minds beyond their bodies, beyond time, to a place where they knew that they were made of the stuff of stars, that death was just a doorway that led to other great adventures. And when they came to themselves, they knew that nothing would stop them from doing the things they loved with their life. And so once again they were hoisted up by that great birdman, waving goodbye to those hospitable people as they soared off, out towards home, heading north, seeing below them the temples of the Andes, out across the sea and then across the eastern seaboard of America. Up, up, up they went and flew over Toronto, where Dad would long to return one day, he said. And then they started to descend toward Newfoundland, the bird calling, "You can rest here before we cross the ocean tomorrow." But he didn't go down to the island. He headed straight for the cliff face. And before they got to it, they could see that it wasn't just solid. There were almost doorways cut in at seemingly equal intervals, as though they were upheld by great craggy Corinthian pillars. And into one of these caves, in they flew, weaving this way and that way between great knotted pillars of rock, until they were settled down on a lagoon. And on the banks they were lit by a fissure from the sky. And the birdman looked up, and the daughter said, Dad, she said, pointing at the pillars. The pillars are moving. And they were, because they weren't pillars. They were the legs of giants who stood with the island resting upon their backs. And as they looked up at them, the great giants pressed one hand against the island as though it was fall, and leant down with their other hand towards them. And one called out in its stony voice, "Welcome, Birdman. It has been a long time." "Yes," said the birdman, 13,000 years. I have had to lay low in these dark times, but now the time is coming where the giants will walk the earth once more. But first," and the birdman pointed out the young girl, who stepped forward, and he said, "First, this young girl will tell your story. We'll tell it so that people will be ready for your coming." The girl beamed with pride, and she didn't know how the birdman knew, but she'd already begun to write her show, all about the adventures that she was having. And as she was thinking those thoughts, the son piped up, as he often did, "You must be so bored holding up this island for, 13,000 years? Why don't I teach you a game. It's something to bide the time." And so he did. He taught them a semblance of tennis, using a great glacial boulder, the giants holding up the ceiling with one hand, batting the stone back and forth across the lagoon with the other, shouting and laughing until the father and the children were ushered to sleep and awoke knowing that they would never say goodbye to the giants because they were already airborne, and the Birdman was flying them off towards home on those oceans of orange dawn light. And eventually, when they arrived at Island and looked down into the waters, there were warships down there. And the warships saw them too, and not knowing what this strange airborne thing was, they began to fire their cannons. And as the shells burst and thundered around them, the sun covered his ears again and began to sing with all his might, "Don't say a prayer for me now. Save it till the morning after. No, don't say a prayer for me now. Save it till the morning after." And as he sang, the bird veered off and took them to safety, going north to Norway, where they found themselves flying into a steep-sided fjord, in the midst of which was an island. The bird settled them down and untrestled them from their net once more, and then he stepped forwards, and with his hands and his clawed nails, he scraped out the shape of a great door, and then, calling out with his screeching sound 3 times, once, twice, 3 times, the door lit up blue, and he pressed his way in. And before them, in the entrance to the cave, stood figures right out of a story. Tall, elfin beings with long, flowing fairy hair and ears. And they said in one voice, "Welcome, Birdman. It has been a long time. Is now the hour for us to reintroduce magic to the world?" "Soon," said the Birdman. And then he looked at the girl, and she didn't need any more cues. She stepped forward and she said, "First, I need to write about you in a way that people will be able to understand, and so they won't be afraid, and they'll know that magic is real, and I've no idea how I'm going to do that." The Queen of the Elves stepped forward and stooped her head down and said, "Child, we taught the Greeks how to write about things that men could not palate. We will teach you too." And the daughter beamed with delight, the thought of being trained by the ancients how to write. And they were ushered into the caves, impossibly lit and huge. And there where they were settled, eating fine fruits and nettle soup and drinking crystalline waters, the father once again thought he should be just as hospitable and return the favour he gave over his flask to the fairy who was with them. "Fine brandy," he said. "I prefer Armagnac." Armagnac, that's what I want to do. I want to write almanacs." "No," said the elf. "Armagnac, a fine brandy. In fact, really good if you mix it with bitters and ice and the twist of lemon peel like a slender horse's neck. There's a cocktail for you." And finding that they liked such drinks, they should surely know about cricket, the father thought it only right to introduce them to the game. And so he did. The elves, in their way, carved out a stunning cricket bat and made a ball of light that they battered around the great halls to echoing shouts of 4, 6, Owsay! And as they played on, the Birdman had gone in search of safe passage for the family to return home. And when the Birdman returned, they said their goodbyes, and they were taken up by the great bird and settled onto the back of a friendly whale, who took them floating off out across the waters. And as the Birdman let go of his rope, he called out his goodbyes by simply saying, "I will meet you in the dream world." And off he flew. And the family, quite proudly, came into the shores of home. And against those white cliffs, as they got off the boats, they could see caves. And you could see them looking at each other and wondering what existed inside of those caves. But they thought that would be for another day, another story. And this story ends were 3 people all the wiser, coming home and finding they hadn't been missed at all. Their mum had got a dog. She'd named it Peppy, and she'd had plenty of time to paint, and she'd in fact painted many other dogs, and with the paintings she'd sold, she'd got lots of money. In fact, they were now comfortably well off, enough so that they could pay their daughter's way to study drama. And when the time came, the daughter set out their amazing story in a tour that went to places no other theatre had gone, off to the Amazon, the first show to play on that river, up across to Newfoundland, to Toronto, where it went down with giant applause, and out across to Fjord Islands, where after the show, the audience and the cast together got to play a fair game of cricket and drink cocktails. And by the time they returned home, the boy, well, he'd written all about the emerging pop culture around the world, and he had such experience and had learned so much that he had enough to write by himself. And the father, well, he too had written all about cricket matches played across the world, even adding an appendix about cricket played with strange and beautiful creatures, which were just a story then, but became real as they are real now, for these creatures truly, truly live, as in this story, and in reality. And the family now, more so than they ever were before, were truly happy.